Hey, in phys class, this is section 9.2, and we're going to look at the anatomy and physiology of the human heart. To this point, we have kind of tackled what the circulatory system is responsible for doing, and now we're going to go into much greater detail about the structure of the heart, the function of the heart, and what role it has with the circulatory system. To give you a little an idea of its size, it's about the size of a fist, and it's located in the mediastinum, which is a cavity that we looked at probably the first and second week of school. But to give you a little idea of where it's at, I got two images here. And as you can see kind of from a side view here and a frontal view, it's kind of in a space between lungs, backbone, and sternum. Remember, sternum is in your chest. If you don't know where your lungs are, yikes. You should know where your lungs are. But as another anatomical point, it is between the second up here and the fifth rib. So let's move on and take a look at some other parts of the heart. All right, a lot going on in this slide, but before we get into parts of the heart, we're going to kind of look at what covers the outside of the heart. And as you can see up top here, the heart is surrounded by a pericardial cavity, and that's going to contain some fluid. What that fluid's going to do is essentially reduce friction. If these muscular systems were always rubbing up against each other, they would definitely not function that well. You'd probably get some inflammation in that area, which is actually very common. Sometimes this pericardial cavity can break apart in certain individuals and actually cause some friction when that heart is beating. The fibrous pericardium encloses the heart kind of like a bag and has two layers that I have mentioned here and here, the visceral and pericardial. But the image down here in the bottom left will definitely give you an idea of how that heart is in a bag. And that bag actually has a little bit of airspace. So what I want you to kind of imagine is that these two cavities, the visceral layer, which would be this inner layer, and the parietal layer, which is an outer layer, is going to kind of act like a bag, or in this case, a balloon. And if you ever put your fist into a balloon, you notice that the balloon will actually create a kind of cavity, and then it'll move around your fist. So kind of have that envisioned in your mind as we discuss this pericardial tissue. But essentially, it's there for protection, and also it is going to be filled with air out here, and then it's going to have some fluid kind of on the inside, and that's all responsible for reducing friction. You can probably imagine what type of benefit this is going to have. It's going to act very similar to an airbag in a car. So when you hit the brakes or hit something and the airbag goes off, your head is going to move into that airbag, and that's going to kind of cushion that response that your head had as it moves forward, prevents any injury. So that's the same kind of concept that we're discussing here. On the right, I kind of have more of a diagram that's going to look at these different layers. This is essentially right here, we're going to talk about on the next slide. This is actually a portion of cardiac tissue, so this would be the heart. Over here are those various layers. So we have the parietal on the outside, and we have the visceral on the inside. And just like I showed you in this picture, you're going to have an air gap here. And then right here, where it meets the heart, you're going to have a fluids area. So let's move on. Now that we know what encloses the heart, let's look at the actual layers of the heart. Now the heart is a muscle, okay? And we discussed that on the previous slide that it is enclosed in a pericardium. But there's also portions of this muscle that we're going to look at. The epicardium, which is that outer layer. And again, that's going to be, it's not shown in this picture, but it's going to be in contact with that visceral pericardium. There's the myocardium, which is the middle layer, and that's mostly cardiac muscle. As you can see here, these are be considered muscle cells as we move out through parts of the heart. And again, cardiac muscle, very similar to smooth muscle and skeletal muscle, but also has some subtle differences. And then finally, endocardium, which is going to be this inner layer, and that is where we're actually going to have our blood, and that's going to come in contact with that. So it's a little bit of different type of tissue, as you can see in this image here. So let's look at the various chambers and valves. This is going to take a little bit of time to go through. And in terms of you drawing a picture, not very important right now. I'm going to get you a picture that you can look at. You might already have it in your possession right now, and feel free if you want to, as we're going through this, fill in that diagram and identify the anatomical structures of the heart. We'll also look at how the blood runs through it. But as I mentioned in 9.1, your circulatory system kind of works in two circulations: systemically throughout the body, and pulmonary, which is from the lungs to the heart and back. And with that said, your heart is also considered a double pump. So your heart is a double pump, and we have a double circuit. And we also have a pulmonary section, which is going to be going to the lungs, and a systemic section through the rest of the body. So things that I've already mentioned before, but just going to kind of reiterate when discussing parts of the heart. So what we're going to do next is kind of go step by step and really look at the various chambers. And you have a 4-chamber heart, and then obviously the various valves that are in there, which are shown in white. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4 valves, and then our major arteries and veins that come off of it, and that's where the blood is going to leave the heart and flow either to the lungs and back or to the rest of the body and back. So let's take a little more in-depth look. All right, a lot of information going on in this slide, but what I want you to focus on is the 4 chambers that our heart has. So we have 2 atria, a right and a left, and please notice that these are already anatomically described. So right now, looking at this image, you're like, wait a second, that's on the left, but you got to get in the map. You got to get inside your body and realize that for you right now, standing here, this is your right atrium to the right portion of your body, and this is your left atrium. And they are very thin, small upper chambers. So one up here, and you can kind of see their size is much smaller. Right atrium is definitely going to be bigger than the left, and we'll talk about why that is. And notice that these atria are going to be receiving blood that returns to the heart through the veins. Okay, so they're always going to be on the receiving end of blood. Now, how that varies from the ventricles. The ventricles are always going to be on the bottom. All right, we have our right ventricle here and our left ventricle here. And the septum is this big chunk right in the middle that's going to separate these two ventricles. I'm moving the cursor on right now. Now, ventricles are very thick. You can see if you look at the lining of the atrium versus the lining of the ventricle, there's a major difference. They're going to be receiving blood from the atria above. So right away, you kind of get the idea that it always moves from A to V. All right, so when blood comes in from the body, and it's going to come down your superior vena cava, which we'll talk about later, it's going to enter this right atrium. So it has received blood returning to the heart. So once it gets into that right atrium, it's going to move into a ventricle through a valve. All right, and that is then going to pump out of the body. So essentially, the atrium really doesn't do much squeezing, okay? When your heart pumps and you get those ba-bump, ba-bump, a lot of it is these valves opening and closing. But this ventricle is going to be responsible for squeezing blood out. And if you kind of get the idea, some of it's going to go to the right and some of it's going to go to the left. Well, this would be anatomically right, this would be anatomically left. And take a second to think where that's going. Came from the body, and now is going to go to the left and to the right. Hopefully in your mind right now you're thinking of the lungs, and that is 100% right. So ventricles are going to force blood out of the heart and what we're going to call our pulmonary arteries. So 2 atria, 2 ventricle, 1 septum that basically separates those chambers. All right, so let's describe these valves. Valves of the heart allow for what we call one-way flow of blood, and that's always going to be from atrium into ventricle. You never want it to go backwards, and the way these are designed anatomically, their structure opens up. It's very similar to if you've ever seen French doors in a house that kind of open up. And if blood ever tried to come back, it would immediately shut those doors. So that is a definite structure and function in the human body. Now we have 2 what we call atrioventricular valves. And if you take a second, think about it a little bit, we got atrio and ventricle. We can simplify these into what we call AV valves. Now they are valves that separate the atria from the ventricle, which is pretty easy to remember. We have a left AV valve, which is going to be over here, and it has a nickname. Two nicknames, actually, the bicuspid valve and the mitral valve. So I know this might be confusing. Now, the reason I bring this up is for those of you in here that are going to go into healthcare fields. They might, in your classes at the college level, discuss this as a bicuspid valve or a mitral valve or a left atrioventricular valve. So in terms of an assessment in this class, I am perfectly fine accepting all of these, but I will probably use left and right AV valve the most, just because it's simpler. So the left AV valve is going to be between the left and the right atrium, so it's going to be located right here. And the right AV valve, or right atrioventricular valve, is also called the tricuspid. Same thing applies. Don't expect everybody to know this, but you may see that in the future. And that is going to separate the right atrium and right ventricle. So it's going to be located right here. So you can see it says tricuspid valve. So you have the left AV, right AV, which separate blood from the atrium and the ventricle. And remember, big thing with valves, allow for one-way flow of blood. It can only go from atria to ventricle. If it goes backwards, those doors will immediately shut. All right, next up we're going to talk about our semilunar valves, and we have two of those as well. And you can see that we're going to discuss these as the aortic valve, which is going to be hiding behind here, and you can see its name. I'm sure you might have some preconceived notions as to where that blood is going to be left into. And we also have the pulmonary valve. Again, might have some preconceived notions as to where that's going to go. Let's start with the aortic. The aortic valve is going to essentially be coming out of the left ventricle. So blood's going to go through the atrium, through the left AV, into the left ventricle, and out this aortic valve, into the aorta, which is our biggest artery. We call this puppy Big Red. And it is essentially going to be pumping blood with the highest pressure. Okay, the blood going through there is going to be the highest pressure because this circuit is going to be the systemic circuit. You will see right here that we have a couple arteries. This is going to be a subclavian to a shoulder, and this is going to be a carotid up to the neck. We'll deal with those later. The pulmonary semilunar valve is located right here. Okay, and that's going to let blood into these pulmonary arteries, which again are going to take blood to the left lung and blood to the right lung. So that's going to be coming out of the right ventricle, and it's going to go right out through here into the artery. So that is the pulmonary valve. Again, reminder, these are valves, so they have one-way flow. If blood comes back this way for some reason, those valves will shut. And if you have valve issues, which is very common when certain heart defects, that is something that needs to be taken care of because you will have very poor blood pressure, most likely low blood pressure, and that can cause some serious health risks. All right, here's some views of the valves. As you can see, this is a cross-sectional cut. That's what we call that there. And we're looking at the top view. So it's if you were eyeballs were looking down this way. And you can see the tricuspid valve. You can see the mitral valve. You can see an aortic valve and a pulmonary valve. So if you took a heart, cut it in half, you could see all of this. All right. It's also showing the coronary artery, which we're going to learn about. That's the artery that feeds the heart. The heart always feeds itself first. It is a muscle. It needs nutrients. Okay. So this just gives you another view. Not something I really need you to write down, but maybe just to help you kind of get inside the map a little bit. Notice the flaps. You kind of see why they would call this the bicuspid, because it has two flaps, and why this one's called the tricuspid. Now take a second and think why that would be. Okay. What type of blood flow is going through here versus here? Why would you want 3 doors versus 2? What are the benefits? Well, if you know that tricuspid, that's a valve that's going to have very, very high blood pressure. So to me, in my head, it makes sense in terms of structure and function that that would have 3 doors versus just 2 and look definitely a lot bigger. All right, here's a complete diagram of the heart. Now, I'm going to do my best, hoping that I am in class that day, but I want to go through that diagram with you guys. But if for some reason I am not here, I have a diagram here that is going to help you fill that in. Now, I know most of you are very tech savvy and are able to critically analyze and figure out that I can Google a picture of the heart and fill it in. I urge you to do that. So take this as an opportunity if you want to pause the video and fill some of that diagram in. that I have given to you as a paper copy. Or if you want to move on, that's fine and continue taking notes, but no, you can always come back here or Google a picture online to basically identify all these major anatomical parts of the heart. One thing I want you to notice is make sure that you identify number 16 in your diagram. That is something that wasn't on there, but you should all know that that is definitely the pulmonary valve right here that you are missing out on. So I know I put in your diagram, but I know it looks different than the other numbers. It is supposed to be there, but I just wanted to make sure you caught that in your diagram. Now be very careful as you go through this. Number 1 up here, I will kind of tell you right off the bat, is pointing to this aorta. But be mindful of the fact that this kind of runs behind here. So I'm just taking this as an opportunity to show you that. And then if you take a look here, the pulmonaries, they're kind of running off behind as well. So these are going to move out to the lungs. All right, 10 and 4 are going to move out to the lungs. So I don't want to give you too many hints, but I know for a fact that you might get kind of caught up with some of these. Use your anatomical terms. Right here, this is the superior vena cava, and this is the inferior vena cava. So again, you should know that in this class and know those terms, but take a second to very clearly and legibly diagram out this heart. All right, the very last thing that I want you to look at in this section 9.2 is the path of blood through the heart. And this is something that, in addition to your vocab, in addition to the notes that you've taken in the diagram that you're filling out in the homework assignment 9.1 and 9.2, that's all fair game for your test. So this is kind of the last thing that I'm going to discuss and take a second to go through. The numbers are labeled in this picture, as you can see down here, but this is definitely some information that you're going to need to know. The path of the blood through the heart starts with number 1. And notice that blood is coming up from the inferior vena cava and down from the superior vena cava. And this is considered to be deoxygenated blood. And it's going to enter the right atrium. That's where I want you to put a number 1 in your heart diagram. So number 1 is speaking to the fact that we have blood that has come from our systemic circuit and has now entered the right atrium. Blood is then going to move right from the atrium into the right ventricle, and that's going to move through the right AV valve here. Now I don't have that labeled, but it's just kind of a little review to remind you how that blood's going to move through. Notice that it is still blue. It is still deoxygenated. It has not gotten oxygenated yet. So step 2 is going to bring us out of that right ventricle into step 3. Now step 3 states that blood goes out to the pulmonary arteries and heads to the lungs. So in order to do that, it's going to have to go through the pulmonary valve. Again, not mentioned, but a good review. And it's going to take a right-hand turn and a left-hand turn. And that's going to take us to the lungs. All right, and the blood is going to get oxygenated. And I know you can't see that here. Our lungs would be on either side. But once that blood comes back in step 4, it has changed color. Blood returns from the lungs, and it has been oxygenated. It is bright red, okay, as you can see in this image here. Now again, blue and red doesn't necessarily mean that it's exact colors, but it's just giving you some contrast. So 4, blood returns from the lungs, enters the left atrium up here, which is very, very small, goes through the left AV valve, into the left ventricle, and that's number 5 on here. And blood will move into the left ventricle and out through the aortic valve. And that is our last destination in the slide, and that is oxygenated blood is going to move out of the left ventricle through the aorta to the body systemically. So that ends our path of blood, and it really ties everything in that we've learned in this lesson. So make sure you understand the path of blood, and I can identify these parts in the heart, and as well as the anatomical structures in the heart. That's everything I have for this video right now. If you have questions, please feel free to ask. I know I didn't mention it in the last video, but if for some reason I am not here, email me. Find answers to your questions. Take time to study. This is the last piece of notes. You have a homework assignment 9.2 and a quiz next. That's all I have for this one. Yago out.